The story you are about to hear is one of those rare historical episodes that somehow slipped past major publications, documentaries, and widely read biographies. It is not a story that appears in textbooks, nor is it recounted in popular historical programs. Yet, it carries within it an extraordinary message about human resilience, presence of mind, and the ability to make bold decisions in the most unpredictable circumstances. To fully appreciate this event, we must immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the era, a time when aviation was developing at a rapid pace, when pilots were seen as trailblazers, and when every flight demanded equal parts courage and discipline. The men who took to the skies were not just operating machines. They were stepping into an environment where small errors could grow into major problems within moments. They knew the risks, and yet they embraced the responsibility with determination. Our pilot was part of this generation. He grew up hearing stories about the early days of flight, tales of explorers crossing continents and oceans through turbulent weather and technical challenges that would seem unthinkable today. Aviation fascinated him not only because of the machines, but because of the mindset it demanded: awareness, calmness, and the ability to examine situations from multiple angles, even when time was short. He began his training at a young age. His instructors quickly noticed his attentive nature. He wasn't the kind of student who rushed through lessons. Instead, he preferred to take time understanding the principles behind every mechanism, every instrument, every emergency procedure. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply believed that a pilot must know more than how to operate a machine. He must understand it. Training in those years was demanding. Pilots learned not only to take off and land, but also to navigate without advanced systems, using visual cues, compasses, maps, and their intuition. They practiced responses to sudden changes, unplanned altitude drops, unexpected weather shifts, and occasional equipment malfunctions. The goal wasn't to frighten them. It was to ensure that any challenge they faced in the sky could be addressed with clarity, not panic. By the time he completed training, he had already formed qualities that would later influence one of the most crucial decisions of his life. These included patience, careful observation, and an understanding that even complicated problems often had solutions, if one could stay calm long enough to find them. He joined a flight crew assigned to long-distance missions. These missions required steady focus. Hours could pass with nothing but engine noise and the distant horizon. Yet being airborne for so long also meant that even minor issues could become significant. Crews needed harmony, trust in one another, synchronized reactions, and mutual understanding that each person was responsible not only for their own role, but for the safety of everyone on board. The pilot quickly found his place within the crew. His composure helped during stressful moments, and his ability to interpret readings and weather conditions made him a valuable voice during mission planning. The crew developed a rhythm, completing multiple flights with confidence and precision. But then came the mission that changed everything. It began just like any other assignment. The aircraft departed smoothly, conditions appeared manageable, and the team remained focused. Hours later, as they headed back toward their base, they encountered what pilots often fear: technical irregularities. It started with small instrument deviations, slight enough to raise questions, but not enough to justify drastic action. At first, the crew believed they could resolve the issue. They checked systems, made adjustments, redistributed responsibilities, and attempted to stabilize the readings. But gradually, the situation worsened. What initially seemed like a minor malfunction soon grew into an escalating problem. Despite their experience, despite their training, despite every effort they made, the aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. Communications were limited, and time was short. The crew was forced to face a possibility they had hoped to avoid. They might not be able to bring the aircraft home. Their decision to leave the aircraft was not taken lightly. It was the last resort, made only after every other option had been exhausted. They left the aircraft separately, each man landing in a different area, scattered across unfamiliar terrain. Some landed in fields, others near wooded areas, and a few closer to settlements. The pilot in our story touched down in a relatively open space, attempting to find shelter and assess his surroundings. But the region was patrolled, and it didn't take long before he was discovered by local forces. He was detained, questioned briefly, and then transferred to a camp designated for individuals whose flight paths had placed them far from home. The camp itself was strict but predictable. Its routines were rigid: early wake-ups, inspections, meals at set times, occasional assigned tasks, and long intervals during which individuals simply had to wait for information, decisions, or changes beyond their control. But the human spirit adapts. Within the camp, people found ways to support one another, share stories, and discuss events from their lives. They reminisced about home, about families, about small details that brought comfort: favorite meals, places they used to visit, music they remembered hearing on quiet evenings. These conversations helped maintain morale and reminded them that the world outside still existed, even if it seemed far away. The pilot kept mostly to himself, not out of distrust, but because he had developed a habit of observing. He watched how the camp operated, noting who was responsible for which tasks, how different guards behaved, and what routes they patrolled. He noticed the times when the camp was busier and when it became unusually quiet. He paid attention to how supplies arrived, how groups were moved, and how information was communicated. He did not have an escape plan, not yet, but he believed that understanding his environment might one day prove useful. Weeks passed, marked by the same repetitive schedule, until one morning the routine changed. Guards announced that a group would be transferred to another location. This announcement immediately created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Transfers weren't unheard of, but they always carried an element of unpredictability. People whispered quietly, wondering where the new destination might be, what conditions they would face, and whether the transfer meant something significant. The pilot found his name on the list. He joined the group, boarded the transport vehicle, and began a journey into the unknown. Hours later, the vehicles approached a small operational airfield, a place brimming with activity, machinery, and noise. Mechanics were working on engines, workers moved crates and equipment, aircraft stood lined up, each serving a different logistical purpose. And as he stepped out onto that airfield, surrounded by motion and distraction, he noticed something he had not seen in weeks: possibility. Standing on the airfield, the pilot sensed a shift, not in the environment itself, but in what the environment represented. The camp had been a place of rigid structure where every movement was observed and every transition followed a predictable pattern. But here, at the airfield, the world was moving fast. Vehicles rumbled past, mechanics shouted instructions, tools clattered, crates were being loaded with urgency, engines roared in the background. People moved with purpose, each focused on their own task. This was not a place designed for careful supervision of newly arrived individuals. It was a place built for efficiency and motion. And motion always creates gaps. The group of detainees was lined up near a row of crates while paperwork was checked. A guard walked back and forth along the line, glancing occasionally at the group, but his attention was frequently interrupted by workers approaching with questions, documents, or requests for equipment access. Another guard stood several steps away, speaking to someone in a uniform who appeared to be overseeing cargo distribution. The pilot understood immediately that the guards, focused as they were on multiple tasks, simply did not have the capacity to monitor every small movement. He scanned the area around him. To his left, several mechanics were inspecting a transport aircraft, its nose panel open, tools scattered near the wheels. Behind it stood another aircraft, larger and positioned closer to the runway. Workers were loading equipment into its cargo hold. A stack of wooden crates nearby created a blind spot, a temporary wall that shielded a narrow section of the tarmac from view. And beyond that blind spot was an aircraft that, as far as he could tell, was ready for departure. Its engines were not running. The cockpit windows reflected the bright daylight. Its fuselage showed signs of regular use, but nothing unusual. He recognized the overall layout: twin engines, broad wings, landing gear positioned slightly forward. He had flown machines of similar weight and configuration many times before. Even though he had never operated this specific model, he felt confident he could interpret its essentials. The thought that crossed his mind was subtle at first, more of a quiet possibility than a formed plan. A what if. He didn't act immediately. Instead, he observed. He watched how the workers moved between the crates. He noticed when the guard stopped to sign a document, turning his back for several seconds. He noticed a moment when both guards were distracted at the same time, one looking over a manifest sheet, the other answering a call from across the airfield. Several minutes passed this way, each moment adding to the pilot's understanding of the airfield's rhythm. He wasn't looking for the perfect gap. Perfect moments rarely exist. He was looking for a feasible one. Then he felt a presence beside him, the same fellow detainee who had exchanged a meaningful glance earlier. This was a man who, during their time in the camp, had proven perceptive and quiet, someone who rarely spoke but absorbed everything around him. They had never discussed any plan. They didn't need to. Sometimes a shared environment creates a shared instinct. The guard closest to them turned away for a moment, called over by a mechanic seeking permission to move a vehicle toward the hangar. The other guard was still occupied with paperwork. Workers moved in front of the crate stack, creating a shield of bodies for several seconds. It was enough. The pilot shifted his foot slightly, then another. His companion mirrored the motion. They stepped sideways, casual, almost lazy, as if adjusting their stance. Another step brought them partially behind the nearest crate. Another put them completely out of the guard's line of sight. And once they were fully shielded, their pace changed from casual to deliberate. They moved quickly but silently, slipping between equipment stacks. The noise of the airfield covered the sound of their footsteps. Engines hummed, metal clanged, workers shouted instructions. All of it blended into a chaotic background that made their disappearance almost invisible. Within seconds, they reached the aircraft. A small access ladder was positioned near the fuselage. They climbed it swiftly. The cargo compartment was closed, but the side door near the cockpit was unlocked, either left that way by the crew or prepared for an upcoming load. Whatever the reason, it became the key moment the pilot needed. They entered the aircraft. The interior was dim compared to the bright airfield. The pilot moved toward the cockpit, his companion remaining near the door, listening for any signs of pursuit. So far, there was nothing. The cockpit was compact but functional. The pilot sat in the left seat, the traditional position of the primary operator. He took a moment to examine the control panel. The layout was different, but the fundamental elements were familiar. Throttle levers, mixture controls, ignition switches, navigation instruments laid out in a pattern that, though foreign, still obeyed aviation logic. He took a slow breath. This was the moment where calm mattered most. He began powering up the aircraft. The electrical system came alive with faint clicks. Indicator lights glowed softly. The instrument needles shifted. He adjusted the necessary switches, working from memory and intuition. Outside, no alarm had yet been raised. Then came the engines. He activated the starters. One engine began to spin, coughing at first, then gaining momentum. The second followed. The sound drew attention from nearby workers. Several turned their heads, puzzled. A mechanic started walking toward the aircraft, waving his hands as if trying to signal something. Another called out to a colleague, pointing at the cockpit. But by the time they reached the aircraft, the pilot had already released the brakes. The aircraft began to roll, slowly at first, almost hesitantly, then with increasing determination. A few workers started shouting. Someone signaled toward the guards. A vehicle engine sputtered to life, perhaps in an attempt to intercept the aircraft. But momentum is a powerful force once it begins, and the pilot knew how to use it. He turned onto the taxiway. The engines roared louder. The aircraft gathered speed. And then, as the runway opened in front of him like a long, clear path through uncertainty, he pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft accelerated. Faster, faster still. The vibration intensified. The wheels lifted. The ground fell away. They were airborne. The moment the aircraft left the ground, everything changed. The noise of the airfield vanished beneath them, replaced by the steady hum of engines and the open sky stretching endlessly in all directions. For the first time in weeks, the pilot felt a sense of control, fragile, uncertain, but real. Yet the danger was far from over. Taking off had been a bold move. Staying airborne and navigating towards safety would require a different kind of precision. Inside the cockpit, the pilot focused not on the relief of leaving the airfield, but on the tasks ahead. The aircraft controls felt slightly heavier than what he was used to. The instruments displayed information differently, and the layout forced him to think carefully about each action. Still, the fundamentals were there. An altimeter reading steady climb, an airspeed indicator rising into a safe range, a compass whose markings he recognized even if the style was unfamiliar. He kept the climb shallow at first, wanting to avoid drawing attention from anyone who might have access to aircraft beneath them. The engines responded smoothly, a fortunate detail. Had they been poorly maintained or not fully warmed up, the escape could have ended much sooner. But luck, preparation, and timing had converged in their favor. His companion entered the cockpit, closing the door behind him. His face showed a mixture of awe, anxiety, and disbelief, emotions understandable under circumstances like these. Yet he remained quiet, instinctively understanding that the pilot needed focus. He sat behind the seats, bracing himself as the aircraft leveled off. Below them stretched a landscape of forested hills, open fields, winding rivers, and scattered towns. The pilot studied it carefully, trying to identify features that matched what little he remembered from maps he had seen long before. They weren't detailed maps, just general outlines of the region, the shapes of coastlines, mountain ranges, and major waterways. But sometimes, a small memory is enough to form a direction. The sky ahead appeared clear, no other aircraft in sight, but the danger was not only external. He now faced the challenge of navigation. This wasn't familiar territory. There were no electronic navigation systems available to him, no radio aids he could safely use, and no charts in the cockpit labeled in a language he understood. He had to rely on the oldest form of aviation navigation, observing the land below and matching geographic patterns to known regional features. He knew that somewhere ahead, far ahead, there was territory controlled by his own side, but the distance was uncertain. The path was uncertain. The weather, too, was unknown. One major storm, one unexpected mechanical issue, one misjudgment of direction could undo everything. Still, he flew. He made slight adjustments to the heading, aligning the aircraft with a broad river below. Rivers are excellent guides. They rarely vanish. They cut through terrain in recognizable patterns, and they often lead toward larger settlements or major landmarks. Following this one would not guarantee safety, but it would at least provide a sense of orientation. Hours passed slowly. The cockpit grew warm from sunlight streaming through the glass. The engines droned at a steady rhythm, creating a monotony that could lull the mind if one wasn't careful. But the pilot remained alert, scanning for potential aircraft, listening for changes in engine pitch, and watching for shifts in the landscape below. Occasionally, he spoke quietly to his companion, not to discuss plans, but simply to maintain a sense of calm. They shared small observations, comments about the terrain, or the aircraft's behavior. These brief exchanges reminded them both that they were not isolated individuals acting separately, but a team bound by the same fragile hope. Eventually, clouds appeared in the distance, soft, white clusters that seemed harmless at first. But the pilot knew better than to underestimate them. Clouds can conceal terrain, alter wind currents, and obscure visibility. He adjusted his altitude slightly, keeping enough distance to avoid entering them directly. As they approached the cloud formations, turbulence began to shake the aircraft lightly. Nothing dangerous, but enough to demand attention. He held the controls steadily, keeping the wings level. The engines maintained their steady pulse. The aircraft responded well, another small stroke of luck in a day that had already demanded so much from chance. The landscape beneath them gradually began to change. Fields became larger, roads straighter. The patterns of settlements grew more orderly, more structured. This was encouraging. It suggested they were moving toward a region with more developed infrastructure, a sign that they might be approaching familiar territory. But with that possibility came a new concern. If they were nearing areas with more organized activity, they might also be entering regions actively monitored from the air or ground. The pilot adjusted his altitude again, choosing a height that was safe yet not so high as to draw unnecessary attention. He kept the engines running at a steady, moderate output to avoid creating an unusual acoustic signature. His companion leaned forward, looking through the windshield with growing anticipation. The pilot knew that emotion well. It was the feeling of hope mixed with uncertainty, when one cannot tell whether the journey is coming to a successful end or approaching a new challenge. Then, far ahead, he saw something that made his breath catch, not out of fear, but cautious optimism. A coastline. It was not close, but visible enough to identify. The curvature of the shoreline, the way the water reflected light, the shape of the land, these matched the general region he had hoped to reach. If his instincts were correct, they were flying in the right direction. He adjusted the heading once more. The engines hummed. The aircraft held steady. Each minute carried them closer to a place where everything might finally shift from danger to safety. But the journey wasn't finished. They still had to land. They still had to identify a safe airfield. They still had to hope that the aircraft, a machine marked clearly as belonging to the opposing side, would not be mistaken for a threat. Below them, the coastline continued to grow clearer, sharper, more defined. They were getting close, very close. The sight of the coastline strengthened their determination, yet also sharpened their focus. The pilot knew very well that the final stage of the journey was often the most unpredictable. Air travel could appear calm and controlled from a distance, but the decisions made in the last minutes of a long flight could determine everything. They had already accomplished what many would have considered impossible, leaving the restricted airfield, navigating unfamiliar territory, and crossing a vast stretch of land without incident. But to complete their escape, they needed to descend safely onto ground where their arrival would not be misunderstood. The pilot lowered the aircraft's altitude slightly, enough to gain a clearer view of the landscape below. Towns appeared more frequently now, arranged in orderly patterns that suggested a region with well-established infrastructure. Roads intersected at precise angles, and agricultural fields displayed geometric shapes that hinted at organized development. These details reassured the pilot that they had indeed approached the area he had hoped for. Yet even now, there were challenges ahead. They could not simply land at any airfield. Approaching the wrong one could create confusion or even lead to defensive reactions. The aircraft they were flying bore markings unfamiliar to the region they were entering, and even if the intentions were peaceful, a sudden unannounced arrival could be misinterpreted. He needed to find a location where communication, even improvised communication, would be possible. He scanned the coastline for distinctive landmarks, harbors, docks, large buildings, anything that might help identify their position. Coastal regions often contain navigation beacons or patterns of lights used by mariners. Even though it was still daylight, these installations could provide valuable clues. Slowly, piece by piece, The landscape began to match the mental map he had constructed earlier. The pilot eased the aircraft into a gentle turn, aligning them parallel to the shoreline. Flying along the coast was safer than heading directly inland. Coastal regions tended to offer more open space and more visible landmarks. Additionally, flying parallel reduced the chances of appearing to approach a sensitive location head-on. His companion watched silently, trying to interpret every movement of the controls. He trusted the pilot, yet the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on him. He asked a quiet question, whether they were close. The pilot answered cautiously, "Close, yes, but not finished." Below them, the coastline curved inward, forming a wide bay. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and reflective. On the far end of the bay, the pilot noticed something that immediately captured his attention: a long stretch of flat terrain that ended abruptly at the water's edge. It was aligned unusually straight, far too straight to be natural. It looked like a runway. He adjusted his heading again, approaching at a distance to get a better view. As they drew nearer, more details emerged. The runway appeared active, with several small structures nearby. The markings on the pavement were faint from this height, but the layout suggested a controlled airfield rather than an improvised landing area. That was encouraging. Controlled airfields meant trained personnel, and trained personnel tended to follow procedures, which reduced the risk of misinterpretation. Yet, the airfield was not the only option. Further inland, slightly south of the bay, he spotted a second potential landing area. This one looked quieter, a smaller strip, possibly used for local aviation or emergency operations. It lacked the structural complexity of the coastal airfield, but that also meant fewer people and less chance of causing confusion. Choosing between them was not straightforward. The larger airfield offered trained staff who might respond more predictably, but it also meant more attention, more scrutiny, and the possibility of rapid reaction from ground personnel unsure of the aircraft's identity. The smaller field offered discretion, but also greater uncertainty. If the runway was poorly maintained or if no one was present to communicate with, landing there could create logistical complications afterward. The pilot weighed the options, his thoughts steady and analytical. His companion watched the coastline drift beneath them as the aircraft maintained a slow, deliberate path over the bay. Then a new concern emerged. An aircraft appeared in the distance, a small silhouette but unmistakable. It flew at a slightly higher altitude, approaching from a direction that suggested it belonged to the region they were entering. It was not heading directly toward them, but it was close enough to force a decision. They could not remain airborne indefinitely. They needed to choose. The pilot considered the runway by the water again. Its location near the coastline meant it likely served both aviation and maritime operations. Such facilities often handled unexpected arrivals more calmly, having protocols designed for vessels or aircraft that needed assistance. He took a slow breath and made his decision. Turning gradually, he aligned the aircraft with the distant coastal runway. The maneuver was smooth, deliberate, and meant to appear non-aggressive. He reduced altitude once more, keeping a moderate descent rate. The engines responded predictably as they throttled down. The aircraft remained stable, a good sign. The last thing they needed now was unexpected turbulence or mechanical issues. As they approached, the pilot extended the landing gear. The small vibration that followed signified that the mechanisms were functioning correctly. He adjusted the flaps to lower their speed and increase lift. The coastline passed beneath them, revealing clearer details of the airfield. He could now see personnel on the ground, small figures moving near the buildings. He kept the aircraft steady, resisting the urge to rush the approach. A controlled landing, even under uncertain circumstances, was always safer than a hurried one. The runway grew larger, filling the windshield. The engines hummed quietly. The wheels touched the ground with a smooth, measured impact. The aircraft rolled forward, decelerating gradually as the pilot applied the brakes. It came to a stop near the far end of the runway, leaving a respectable distance from the structures and any ground crews. For a moment, there was silence, a long, weighted silence filled with relief, disbelief, and anticipation. They had landed. They had actually made it. But the escape was not yet complete. They still needed to step out and face whoever would approach the aircraft. And soon, figures on the ground began to move toward them. The figures on the ground were small at first, distant silhouettes moving deliberately toward the aircraft. The pilot kept the engines at a low idle, keeping the machine ready but calm. Every movement mattered now. Every sound could be interpreted, every step scrutinized. As they drew closer, the details became clearer. Personnel wearing standard uniforms, moving with efficiency, yet not panicked. They did not rush or shout commands. Their approach was cautious, professional, measured. This was encouraging. Professionalism often brought predictability, and predictability could work in favor of those who understood procedure. The pilot opened the cockpit canopy slightly, signaling that they had landed safely and posed no immediate threat. His companion remained near the side door, eyes scanning for any unexpected movements. The air was tense, yet held a strange serenity, the kind that occurs when the impossible has been achieved, and the next step is uncertain but crucial. The first figure reached the aircraft, squinting up at the unfamiliar markings, then another and another. They stopped a few meters away, maintaining a respectful distance. One of them raised a hand in a universal gesture of acknowledgement, pausing for clarity before speaking. The pilot leaned forward slightly, gesturing with open palms to indicate peace and intention. The companion mirrored him, calm yet alert. Moments stretched into minutes, every second measured, every breath taken carefully. Then one of the personnel stepped closer and asked, in a language the pilot understood clearly, "Who are you? Where are you from?" Relief washed over him. At last, words he could understand. At last, communication. He responded succinctly, explaining their identity, origin, and the circumstances of their unexpected arrival. The personnel listened carefully, asking brief, clarifying questions, their demeanor professional and steady. There was no panic, no alarm, only the slow recognition of a situation unusual, but now under control. Once it became clear that the pilots were allies, assistance arrived quickly. Ground crews began guiding the aircraft to a secure area. Fuel and maintenance checks were initiated. Medical personnel approached, offering reassurance and ensuring that neither pilot had suffered injury or undue stress. The attention was thorough but calm, conducted as procedure dictated. The pilot and his companion stepped out of the aircraft fully, their legs unsteady from the hours of concentration, tension, and adrenaline. They were greeted with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and professional caution. The personnel examined the aircraft, noting its condition and unusual markings. Questions were asked, explanations provided. Each interaction reinforced the reality. They had succeeded. They were safe. Yet, the pilot remained reflective. He understood that the story was far from ordinary. Few could imagine the combination of observation, timing, patience, and skill required to leave a controlled airfield, navigate unknown terrain, and land safely in a region that might have misinterpreted their presence. It was a testament not only to his abilities, but to the subtle interplay of preparation and circumstance. In the following hours, he provided detailed accounts to the authorities, information about the aircraft, the route taken, the timing of every critical decision. His observations would later be used to refine procedures, improve training, and provide insights into navigation, decision-making under pressure, and situational awareness in aviation. The companion who had shared each tense moment remained close, silent at first, then gradually recounting his own experience of the journey. Together, they reflected on the weeks spent in uncertainty, the careful observation of the camp, and the precise timing that had allowed them to seize a moment when opportunity appeared. Even after formal procedures were completed, the story of their escape circulated quietly among colleagues and officers. Though it never became widely publicized at the time, it entered the archives as a remarkable example of initiative, skill, and calm under pressure. It was not a tale of heroics for spectacle. It was a story of human ingenuity applied in an extraordinary context. Years later, historians and aviation enthusiasts would examine this episode, marveling at the combination of courage, careful observation, and improvisation that made the escape possible. They would study maps, flight records, and personal accounts, noting that the pilot's calm, methodical approach, combined with an acute awareness of his surroundings, allowed him to transform what could have been disaster into a successful operation. For those who hear this story today, it serves as a reminder of several truths. Observation and patience are as important as action. Calm decision-making under pressure can change the course of events. Opportunity often arises quietly, unnoticed, and must be recognized swiftly. Skill, experience, and preparation create the foundation for success, but timing and courage complete it. The pilot and his companion returned to regular duties eventually, their journey largely kept private for decades. Yet the lessons of their escape endured, inspiring those who would follow in the field of aviation, navigation, and crisis decision-making. Their story, though quiet for many years, remains a timeless example of how preparation, courage, and the ability to seize opportunity can intersect in the most extraordinary ways. And so, from uncertainty to liberation, from observation to decisive action, their journey reminds us that even in the most constrained circumstances, human ingenuity and perseverance can forge paths previously thought impossible. The skies may have seemed hostile, the terrain unfamiliar, and the outcomes uncertain. Yet careful thought, courage, and skill turned a dangerous situation into one of the most remarkable and inspiring escapes in aviation history.